failure is simply the opportunity to begin again, this time more intelligently.
That's Henry Ford, and it feels pretty relevant for what we're diving into today.
It really does.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're unpacking the latest test flight of SpaceX's Starship, the biggest rocket system ever built.
Yeah, it was quite the event. A flight that, well, it showed incredible progress, but also ran into some, let's say, significant snags. We're going to pull apart what happened.
Right. What went right, what went wrong.
Exactly. And what it all means for, the future of space exploration, the commercial side of things, too.
And we're grounding this whole discussion, just so you know, entirely in the reporting from our source material today, which comes from the BBC.
That's the plan. Stick to the facts as reported there.
Because understanding this stuff, it isn't just, cool science news. These leaps in tech, the challenges, they're really key current affairs, especially relevant if you're tracking science and technology, maybe for UPSC mains or prelims preparation, or honestly, just for general knowledge. Absolutely. So, okay, let's paint the picture. We're talking about the Starship system, the ship stacked on the Super Heavy booster. Massive thing.
Over 120 meters tall, right?
That's it. World's most powerful rocket. Launching from Texas just before dusk on a Tuesday.
And the backdrop here is pretty important, too. This wasn't the first attempt this year, was it?
No, it followed two others earlier in the year that didn't quite hit all their marks. So hopes were, well, pretty high for this third integrated test flight.
People wanted to see some big steps forward.
And, initially, it looked like they got them. The launch itself blasting off the pad, that was smooth.
Good start.
Yeah, and then minutes later, the really critical bit, the stage separation, the ship separating from the Super Heavy booster. That went just as planned.
Okay, that sounds positive. And I saw our source mentions Dr. Jonathan McDowell, the astronomer.
Right, from Harvard-Smithsonian.
He apparently highlighted how far the ship itself actually got. Said it successfully got all the way through its orbit insertion duration.
Yeah, that's a key point he made. Firing its engines for the full intended time to actually make it towards orbit. He called that its greatest progress so far.
So that sounds like a major win, doesn't it?
It is a huge step, technically speaking.
Yeah.
Getting that full burn time is critical. And it is pretty big but.
Uh-oh.
Things started to unravel pretty soon after that separation during what they call the orbital coast phase.
Right. I remember seeing reports, even the SpaceX commentators said something like they'd essentially lost our attitude control. What does that mean practically?
It means basically the spacecraft lost the ability to point itself correctly. It started, tumbling, spinning out of control.
Not good.
Not good at all. Dr. McDowell pointed to this specifically. He called it the big failure of this particular flight test. If you can't control your orientation, you can't really do anything else you planned.
And the end result for the ship itself was pretty dramatic. SpaceX called it a rapid, unscheduled disassembly.
Which is, a very polite way of saying it broke apart. Our source mentioned it sprang leaks, disintegrated while still technically in orbit, and then tumbled down during re-entry.
Wow. Okay, and what about the booster? The Super Heavy.
Well, that didn't quite make it either. Even while the ship was doing its main engine burn, they'd apparently already lost contact with the booster section.
So no controlled landing?
No controlled splashdown as planned. It just ended up plunging into the Gulf of Mexico.
And wasn't there another little glitch mentioned? Something about the payload?
Yeah. They had some dummy Starlink satellites on board, sort of a test of its cargo capability.
Right.
But they couldn't actually deploy them because the payload bay door got stuck. Had to close it again.
So, okay, you add all of that up. It sounds like, despite the initial success, the mission ultimately didn't achieve its main goals.
Pretty much. It failed to complete the flight profile. But, like our source says, it's kind of bittersweet.
Bittersweet, yeah. How so?
Well, because they did make real progress. That full duration burn for orbit insertion is genuinely significant. And they used a booster that had flown before that's a nod towards their reusability goals.
Okay, fair points. Progress mixed with failure.
But yeah, the bottom line is, it was still Starship's third test flight in a row that ended, quite spectacularly and not as intended. Fiery failure, as the source puts it.
Which naturally leads to the big question, right? SpaceX has this amazing track record with Falcon 9. It's super reliable now.
Incredibly reliable.
So does having 3 Starship missions in a row fumble? Does that mean something's fundamentally wrong with how they're developing this much bigger, way more complex rocket?
And that question brings us straight to SpaceX's whole philosophy, doesn't it? The fail fast, learn fast mantra.
Right. That's their whole approach. Rapid iteration. Test flights are expected to push limits. Things will break.
And you treat those failures as data. You learn, you fix it, you iterate, you fly again, quickly.
And they can point to the Falcon program, achieving reusable rockets. That's proof their method can work and lead to breakthroughs.
Absolutely. But the question some experts in our source are raising is, does that same exact approach scale effectively to something like Starship? It's just such a different beast.
Who's questioning it?
Well, Dr. Leonani Alconsol, she's a spacecraft engineer, associate professor, she brings up some pretty critical points.
Like what?
Firstly, the cost. Each Starship test flight, especially when it ends like this, is just vastly more expensive than the early Falcon tests were. You're losing a colossal amount of hardware.
Okay, that makes sense. The scale is just different financially.
And her second point is about the market. Starship's main ultimate goal, taking people to Mars, relies on a market, a need, that basically doesn't exist yet.
Right. Unlike Falcon launching satellites, which is a very real, very established market.
Exactly. So the financial risk of these repeated, very expensive failures is, arguably, much higher and harder to justify purely on current business terms.
Dr. Alconsol also made a point about perception, didn't she? About safety.
Yeah, she suggested that seeing these repeated destructive failures and maybe how the company reacts to them, sometimes seeming indifferent or even celebrating the data, it doesn't necessarily project an image where safety and reliability are the absolute #1 priorities right now, which is, a bit concerning for a vehicle eventually meant to carry humans.
That's a tough critique. What about Dr. McDowell? Did he weigh in on this fail-fast idea for Starship?
He acknowledges the progress, definitely. But he also predicts we're going to see more failures.
Oh, why's that?
He basically puts it down to the sheer novelty of the tech involved. He says there's a whole new generation of space technology packed into Starship, implying these are deep, hard problems to solve. It'll take time and probably more failures to figure it all out.
So it's this picture of huge ambition, Mars eventually.
A grand vision, yeah.
But coupled with these really significant technical hurdles that they're still working through, sometimes very publicly.
And it's not just the Mars dream driving this now, is it? NASA's involved.
Right. NASA wants to use Starship for the Artemis program, for landing astronauts back on the moon and setting up a long-term presence there.
Starship is actually contracted to be the Human Landing System, the HLS. It's a critical piece of NASA's plan.
But hang on, that NASA contract must add some serious pressure, time-wise.
Huge pressure. Our source quotes Dr. David Whitehouse, a journalist and author, who points out that the first crewed Artemis landing using Starship is supposed to happen around mid-2027.
Mid-2027. That sounds incredibly soon, given where things are.
That's exactly the point. Time is really, really running out for Starship to be proven safe and reliable enough for that mission.
What does Dr. McDowell think about that timing? Is 2027 realistic for a crewed moon landing with Starship?
He seems pretty skeptical. He suggests it could easily take many more years. He even warns it could become, and this is his phrase, a very embarrassing thing for NASA to navigate if Starship just isn't ready.
Oof, yeah, that would be awkward.
He also brings up the famous concept of Elon time. The idea that when Elon Musk predicts something will take 1 year.
It often takes more like 3.
Or sometimes longer, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a known phenomenon in the space community.
Okay, so massive technical challenges, huge ambition, and now this intense timeline pressure from NASA. Plus, there's competition ramping up in space, isn't there?
Definitely. Commercial spaceflight is booming. You've got Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin making progress with New Glenn. Various Chinese companies are becoming serious players.
So with these Starship setbacks, is SpaceX actually risking falling behind, losing their dominance?
That's a key question. But Dr. McDowell offers a really interesting counterpoint in the source.
That's that.
He says very bluntly, no one else is even trying something on the scale of Starship.
So even with the failures, they're still operating in a different league, ambition-wise.
That seems to be his take. The sheer scale, the full reusability, the Mars objective. It's just orders of magnitude beyond what competitors are currently building, even if those competitors are making strides.
Okay, that context is important.
And he follows up by saying, look, if SpaceX get it to work, and they have to get it to work, that will cement their position as the industry leader. The potential payoff is enormous if they pull this off.
So it's high risk, high reward, basically.
Very much so.
So after all this, progress, failures, critiques, pressures, Where does that leave the overall outlook for Starship, especially for human flights? Is it optimism? Pessimism?
Dr. McDowell's final thought in the BBC piece is quite telling, I think. He doesn't quite land on optimism.
No. What then?
He describes his feeling as maybe not optimism, but measured confidence.
Measured confidence. That actually sums it up pretty well, doesn't it?
I think it does. It acknowledges the massive hurdles and the setbacks, the reality of the situation, but it also recognizes the sheer scale of what they're attempting, the progress they have made, and the potential if they succeed.
Okay, so let's recap then. We've just taken a pretty deep dive into this latest Starship test flight. We've seen the mix, definite progress, but ultimately not mission success.
Right. We looked at that whole debate around the fail fast, learn fast approach. Is it right for Starship? Considering the scale, the cost, the human rating goal. We heard from Dr. Alkinsell and Dr. McDowell on that.
Yeah, different perspectives there. And we placed it all in the context of SpaceX's huge ambitions, the tight NASA timelines for the moon, and, the competition out there.
And just to reiterate, this whole exploration, everything we discussed, was drawn directly from the source material provided the reporting by the BBC.
Absolutely. And understanding these kinds of developments is, well, it's crucial if you want to stay informed on current affairs, if you're tracking tech innovation.
And it's definitely relevant if you're studying, say, for the UPSC exams where science and tech features heavily, or honestly, if you're just curious about where humanity is headed beyond Earth.
It really is. It leaves you with a bit of a challenging thought, though, doesn't it?
What's that?
When you're aiming for something so ambitious, like getting humans to Mars, is this kind of repeated, expensive public failure just part of the deal, an unavoidable cost of pushing boundaries? Or does it signal maybe a need to rethink the fundamental approach itself?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? Something to definitely mull over as we watch what happens next with Starship.
Indeed. Well, if you found this deep dive useful, please do think about liking and subscribing. It genuinely helps us keep bringing these discussions to you.
And please leave us a comment if you have questions or want to discuss any of this further. We do read them.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.